So the last speaker on this topic, Kris Nichols. So Dr. Kris is the founder and principal scientist of Kris, Knowledge of Regeneration and Innovation in Soil Systems. She was Rodale Institute of Chief Scientist from 2014 to 2017 and a research soil microbiologist with USDA for 14 years. Kris has BS degrees in plant biology and genetics and cell biology, MS in environmental microbiology, and PhD in soil science. She was raised on a 640-acre farm in southwest Minnesota. Please welcome Dr. Kris. If you want to wear this.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. As was stated, I was raised on a farm in southwestern Minnesota. I actually spent about 11 years in North Dakota, and it's interesting because this is my first time actually to Manitoba Ag Days. So spending all of that time not that far away, and it's my first time here, so I'm very glad to be here. What I want to talk to you about today is looking at regenerating soils with soil biologically based systems. So we've heard some of the speakers this morning talk to you about this idea of regenerative agriculture and also discussing sort of concepts and ideas and possibilities that we can utilize to be able to address regenerative agriculture. Lana just did a great job talking about intercropping. I know Yvonne this morning was talking about cover cropping and those types of things. We have a lot of options to be able to look at regenerative agriculture. But when we're thinking about regenerative agriculture, the main things to think about and focus in on are the fact that this is a systems approach. And it's a dynamic, innovative, and integrated systems approach, meaning that it is a systems approach that is not something where we can strictly define and get ourselves stuck in the ideas of concepts or in the ideas of what exactly you have to do. The idea behind this is looking at creating options for ourselves. Being able to get farming and ranching and grazing practices to actually have this more innovative type of a design. And in this, we're going to be rebuilding soil organic matter. We're going to be increasing soil biodiversity and content. And we're going to be focusing on the problem and not issues. What we have done, especially in conventional agriculture, is we focus on the issues. I don't have fertility. My soil is too heavy. My soil is too sandy. It's too hot. It's too cold. It's too wet. It's too dry. These are all issues. This is not the problem, but we spend all of our time and our energy and our money on focusing on issues and not addressing the problem. And the problem that we're seeing is that we don't have enough soil. We need to regenerate soil. And if we do that, that is going to help us to improve the water cycle and fertility. It is going to help us to be able to enhance the resiliency and the nutritive quality of the system. Lana just talked about enhancing resilience. You have better resilience when you do this intercropping. We're going to be able to utilize the energy and the power of photosynthesis. And for me, as a scientist and a real big geek here, I'm going to say we're going to do this by focusing on the system at a subatomic and an atomic level, looking at how energy is flowing from the sun through carbon into plants, microbes, and animals. Essentially, all biology is functioning, everything is functioning on an interwoven, complex, yet elegantly simple repeated pattern design matrix. Biology follows some of the same principles and rules and ideas and concepts on a continuous basis. But what we're really trying to do here again is utilize that idea to regenerate soils. That is our problem. Again, we don't have enough soil. So we need to regenerate our soil. Soil, in and of itself, is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen bound to a mineral matrix of sand, silt, and clay. You don't need to worry about sand, silt, and clay. It's part of the parent material. It is part of the land base. What we want to do is get carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen into the system. So how are we going to go about being able to do that, being able to address those types of issues? And one of the ways in which we can do this is actually recognizing what gave us soil to begin with. Land mass, when in early Earth, land mass was not soil. It was land. It was sand, silt, and clay, bound in a mineral matrix. What we want to do in creating soil, in regenerating soil, is to follow those same principles and the ideas of how soil first originated. And soil first originated through the relationships primarily of mycorrhizal fungi and the precursor to land plants, a photosynthetic bacterium. In this aquatic environment, before they came onto land, they were in water. And in an aquatic environment, they got together because they could improve the efficiencies and the needs for both of the organisms involved in this relationship, for both the photosynthetic bacterium as well as the fungus. Because the fungus in the aquatic environment needed carbon. It needed food. The photosynthetic bacterium would essentially do photosynthesis, which would create carbon. But to do photosynthesis, to have the enzymes to do photosynthesis, it required various types of elements, micronutrients, elements to come from the aquatic environment. And when you're microscopic and single-celled, basically the only way in which it can be that you can absorb those elements is if they bump into you in the water. So you're basically swimming around. You're not even really swimming. You're just kind of moving around in the ocean. And you're waiting till you bump into something. Now, the body of the fungus, instead of being sort of a single cell that's just floating around, the body of the fungus is a thread. And it's going to be in that aquatic environment going like this. And so it's going to have what we call a greater surface area to volume ratio, meaning there's more exposure on the surface than the volume, the diameter, the size of those tubes. And so what this means is it is going to be more efficient at being able to get into contact with those elements that are needed for photosynthesis. So one day, we're just going to kind of imagine this in our heads. This isn't exactly how all of this happened. But one day in our heads, the two bump into each other. And when they bump into each other, the bacterium says to the fungus, hey, I got a lot of carbon I can give you. You seem to be able to have this excess in these elements that I need to do photosynthesis so I can make more carbon. Why don't we join up and work together? We know that this has happened, even though this happened 450 to 500 million years ago. We know this has happened because we've been able to see precursors of this and look at genetic information, and we can see this today in modern day lichens. It's an algal fungal relationship that dissolves rocks. That's what this first relationship did, utilizing this information. So we have no soil without plants, and we have no plants without mycorrhizal fungi. So we needed to have both of those elements involved in this. This is what is the foundation of what we can do today. This relationship still exists today, and we can tap into the efficiencies of this relationship in order to be able to maximize what we can do. So if you look at these pictures, these two pictures that are in black and white, these are actually from fossilized roots of some of the earliest land plants. If you look at this picture, this was actually a picture from a switchgrass plant that I took in the early 2000s when I was in North Dakota. But you can see similarities in how this looks. This is the fungal hyphal tube. This is the fungal hyphal tube. You've got what we call arbuscules, these highly branched structures. You've got arbuscules. This is just a higher magnification picture of this. This relationship exists today, and it does many of the very same things that it did back 450 to 500 million years ago. And it's going to allow us to be able to get carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen into the mineral matrix of sand, silt, and clay that we currently have because we've lost carbon and lost soil. So it's going to allow us to be able to make more soil, to regenerate soil. Now, as a soil scientist, I was taught at university that you cannot change organic matter percentages in your lifetime. And that it takes 1,000 years to generate an inch of topsoil. You're not going to live 1,000 years. I'm telling you that we can do this, but then I told you that what we are taught and how we look at things says that we can't. But how it is that we're going to go about doing this is not, as Lana was saying, this is not the same way as looking at this the same way that your granddaddy did. It is looking at this differently. It's utilizing that information, but actually then combining it with modern tools and modern knowledge to be able to enhance this more. When we're talking about 1,000 years to generate an inch of topsoil, what ends up happening is to do that, we have to break down parent material that's buried a meter or two or more down in the soil. We have to have that, so down below in ground. We're going to take that, we're going to break down that parent material. We're going to have that migrate up through the C horizon, the B horizon, and up towards the surface. And then we're going to have that combine with organic matter. And that whole process is going to take time. I do not dispute that if we're doing a bottom-up approach, it will take 1,000 years to generate an inch of topsoil. I don't have a problem with that. But that isn't the only way to generate topsoil. That isn't the only way to do regeneration. Because what we're going to do is we're going to do a top-down approach. We already have the minerals, sand, silt, and clay, that have migrated up and are sitting on the surface. What we are missing is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And I'm keeping to talk about carbon because this is what it is that we need to focus in on. You are no longer farmers and ranchers that are growing crops and animals. You are farmers and ranchers that are growing carbon. That is your cash money. That is how the economics are going to be flowing here. You're going to utilize tools, cropping tools, not just mechanical tools, but biological tools, not just chemical tools, but biological tools to regenerate the soil. You're going to be utilizing biological tools to introduce carbon. You're going to be utilizing animals to be able to help you to be able to get more carbon in the ground. But it is all about putting carbon into the system. Everything else is a tool. And you have, again, in regenerative agriculture, you have options to be able to choose from an almost unlimited suite of tools. So, now we're thinking about how it is that we can solve the issue with regenerating topsoil, but how is it that I could really be able to address the amount of organic matter that I have in my soil over time? So again, I said we're going to take a systems approach. We're going to start with photosynthesis. That's going to be the focus we're looking at. Because what we want to do is we want to tap into the most efficient. And when I'm talking about efficiencies here, what I am talking about is not necessarily something that's going to maximize yield. The word that has done the biggest harm to farming and ranching since civilization first started is the Y word, yield. Because we use that as the single tool to tell us how much money we can make. When we're talking about efficiencies, it is looking at maximizing the ability to convert chemical energy into the bonds between carbon atoms and other atoms. Photosynthetic reactions. If we maximize efficiencies in the system, utilizing photosynthesis, utilizing processes that biological organisms are involved in to be able to enhance fertility, able to manage water, to do those types of things, maximizing efficiencies is going to improve our profit. You don't take yield to the bank. Your bank account is based on profit. The bank doesn't care how much yellow grain you have. Your banker doesn't care how many pounds you put on the animal. What your banker cares about is how much it costs you to do that. In the US, and I'm sure it's very common here in Canada as well, but in the US right now, many farmers are going through the farm magazines, and they're looking through their farm magazines at the guys who won the yield contests. And they're looking at it, and they're going to the coffee shop, and they're talking about it, and they're thinking, okay, how could I put that stuff into action? Because these guys won the yield contest. Ask yourself a different question. If this was profitable for them, don't you think that they would have put it in more acres than the number of acres it did to qualify for the yield contest? The yield contest is about bragging rights at the coffee shop. The issue with us colonizing the moon or going to Mars is not an issue on do we know how to do it. We actually have a lot of the technology we would need to do it. The issue is nobody can write a check that big. Because neither the moon nor Mars have soil, and we need to make it to grow our food. And nobody can write a check that big. Why is it that you think you can write a check that big? Because that's what it is that we're creating right now in the agricultural practices that we're using. Because we are losing soil at an astounding rate. In the U.S., we went in the early 1970s, we went from losing 3 billion metric tons of topsoil every year to the latest number is 1.6 billion metric tons of topsoil. Yay us! We cut it in a little less than half. Yay us! In the last couple of years, because of what has been happening with precipitation patterns and weather patterns, that number is going up rather than going down. So we're probably, when we get the next data, I'm going to estimate we're probably going to be about 1.75, maybe even up to 1.8. So, yay us. We're doing a good job. At the 1.67 number, if you were to load all of that topsoil onto rail cars, that's going to hold, each car is going to hold 100 tons of topsoil. If you were to load all of that topsoil onto rail cars, the length of that train would stretch around the equator over 7 times. Yay us. This is what we do every year. So again, we're going to have to start writing really big checks. And the banker is going to have a lot of concerns about that. Bankers in the U.S. and I'm sure here in Canada are having a lot of concerns right now. Because although they recognize that agriculture and food production is the most important job that we can possibly have, that the only thing that has intrinsic value is land, is soil, and they want to invest in that, and investment companies are looking at investing in that, they're also seriously concerned about the value of that investment because profitability is not working out. Not so long ago in my life, again, I'm an American, so I apologize. A lot of my stuff is on the U.S. side, but it's very true in Canada. Not so long ago, I'm going to apologize again. I'm an American and I'm sorry. And right now, I am really, really, really desperately sorry. USMCA, thank you. USMCA, all of those things. I am desperately sorry, guys and gals. But here's the thing. Not so long ago in my lifetime, we were, as U.S. citizens, we were concerned about the fact that our national debt over $1 trillion. Our budget deficit today is over $1 trillion. That's not our national debt. That is our budget deficit. That is our shortfall every year. You know what our banker in China is thinking? Uh-oh. Maybe this wasn't a good plan. These guys are idiots. It worked for us before when they were idiots and they bought all our stuff. But these guys are idiots. This is not something we can continue to be able to afford to do. So what do we want to do? Again, we want to address the carbon problem. We want to regenerate soil. So this is a farmer. Some of you may have heard of him, David Brandt. He lives in Carroll, Ohio. This is David Brandt's soil. This is the soil that, according to NRCS, according to the soil survey, this is the soil that David Brandt should have. This is the soil across the fence line on his uncle's farm. Why is this the case? Because over 35 years, David Brandt has put in place practices to regenerate the soil, to put carbon. This looks like you got carbon in there. To put carbon back in the ground, top-down regeneration of soil, binding carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen to the mineral matrix. And how are we going to go about doing that? Well, the first thing that we look at when we talk about this is a graph from Matan Lal. Many of you have probably seen this, where we've seen this loss of carbon as we started tilling up our soil. So one of the first things that people talk about is you just need to reduce tillage. And that's a good idea, reducing tillage. Eliminating tillage obviously is a good idea. Because basically the system has been hemorrhaging carbon, and what reducing tillage is going to do for us is it's going to stop the bleeding. But if you have a patient that has been hemorrhaging, and all that you do is stop the bleeding, but they've been hemorrhaging for quite some time, and you stop the bleeding, you put a tourniquet on and you stop the bleeding, if you don't get that patient to a hospital and get them a transfusion, they will die anyway. The transfusion for our soils is the influx of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. It's the influx of carbon. So yes, tillage will help to stop the bleeding. But if we're not coupling tillage with cover cropping and intercropping and polycropping and relay cropping and animal integration and perennials and annuals and annuals and perennials, one or more of these tools to put carbon in the ground, the soil will die anyway. And it's not just the soil that becomes the problem, because the soil also addresses our air and water quality. And our air and water, well, especially our water amount. The best air and water filters on the planet are carbon-based filters. You buy a Brita water filter, you buy a pure water filter, part of that filtration system contains a carbon filter. You ingest toxins, go to the hospital, the first thing they will do is inject charcoal into your stomach. Because carbon has an incredible binding capacity. It has, in that binding capacity, that is what you need for long-term fertility. If you can bind nutrients and keep them, when they're bound to carbon, in a more exchangeable form, chemical form, they can be more readily available to plants and animals. It is why we eat food that is carbon-based, because there is nutrients that we need. We don't just need carbon, we need nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur and copper and zinc and iron. And we get that from our food because carbon binds that. So if we have carbon in our soil, if we have soil, we are going to be able to have better water quality and air quality. We are also going to improve the mass of water that we have, because in addition to binding nutrients, carbon will also help us to hold water. So we can enhance our water holding capacity, more efficiently utilize water. As a kid growing up in the Midwest, in Minnesota, southwestern Minnesota, we were always jealous of the guys south of us and east of us, because you're always jealous of, the grass is always greener on the other side, right? There's issues. Now, I blame the reason that we live there is because, and I'm going to apologize for this, I come from Ireland. I'm primarily Irish. As a background, German and Irish. So I'm German and Irish, and I apologize to anyone who might get offended by this, but oftentimes I say, what I want to do is I want to be an equal opportunity offender. So by the time that you leave here, hopefully I've said something that's offended you. And in being an equal opportunity, as a German and Irish person, as an Irish person, I'm really stupid. And as a German person, I'm really stubborn about the stupidity. And so I blame the fact that my family ended up in Minnesota on my Irish-German ancestry. And the Irish part of it is my great-grandfather came to the United States looking for a rock pile to farm. And he went all over the United States. He started on the East Coast, he went to the Midwest, he went to the West Coast. He went everywhere to find the biggest rock pile he possibly could. And then he landed on it, and he was happy there. And my family is still there on the big rock pile. And being on the big rock pile, again, you're always jealous of the other places around you. And part of the reason we were jealous of some of the places around us was because when it came to water, there was something called the Ogallala Aquifer. I don't know if you know about the Ogallala Aquifer, but it's one of the largest aquifers in North America. And the Ogallala Aquifer As I was growing up, part of our reason of jealousy was the Ogallala Aquifer was always going to have water. So if there was an issue for us in raising crops with water, if you could tap into the Ogallala Aquifer, you were going to be fine. They were always going to have water. Right now, we're currently debating about how many years the Ogallala Aquifer has before it runs dry. When I was a kid, this was never even a thing we talked about. It was never going to run dry. It was never going to be an issue. So again, we need to be looking to regenerating soil if we want to solve the issues that we have. So we're going to regenerate soil primarily through biology. And we're taking a look at this in a very different way. So this is sort of a classic diagram, been used multiple times in multiple ways. This is our soil. And when we measure organic matter, we measure it in the whole soil mass. So when we're talking about the percentage of organic matter, it is, you have most of the mass is mineral, the small sliver is organic, and that tells you basically the amount of organic matter that you have. That small sliver is basically the carbon that you have that's in that organic form. And so when it is that we want to change organic matter percentages, the reason why somebody tells you that you can't change organic matter percentages in your lifetime, that you can't be David Brandt and have your soil look like it, it is impossible. It's an artifact. David Brandt did something. He went out there and painted all of his soil black. It's really cool. He would go out there before people would come and paint it all black. Got to have a good labor force for that one. And his labor force is actually billions strong. His labor force is his microbial community. They did the painting for him. Because what they did here is this small sliver, if you make a little bit of a change, so this is the labile particulate organic matter, this is what you put in on an annual basis, this is the microbial fraction, and this is what they call the stable humus fraction. And the reason they say you can't change organic matter percentages is 3/4 of this small sliver is stable. It takes 100 to 1,000 years to form. It's highly decomposed, organic materials, takes you a really long time to form. You can impact the labile fraction and a little bit impact the microbial fraction, but if you impact the labile fraction, most of that organic matter that's there goes back up into the atmosphere in a couple of years. Your residue decomposes and becomes CO2 again. So that can't build up to be part of the organic matter you see here. So again, if 3/4 of you takes a really long time to form, about 1/4 of you goes away in a year or two, how could you possibly impact this sliver enough to change its percentage? Since it's a small amount that you're measuring in the overall mineral matrix to begin with. It's an unmeasurable thing to do as scientists. That's what we say. We can't really measure it. It's not going to be able to happen. Now, what we have started to see is that we are actually changing the way that this pie looks. Because we've had researchers that have taken a look at the stable humus fraction and said that it's not what we thought it was. So as we look at seeing that we can change percentages so the pie gets bigger, how did that happen? How did David Brandt do what he did? How do we get there? And so one of the things that we're saying with this is that a portion of this recalcitrant, this stable humus, is actually stabilized by biological processes, by the microorganisms. And so now, if we can impact on an annual basis more than half of the organic matter that we have, we can start substantially changing how much organic matter we're going to keep in the soil. And again, organic matter, carbon in our soil, organic matter is mostly carbon. Well, not mostly, it's about half carbon, a little more than half. So organic matter in our soil is what it is that we're trying to do. We're trying to put carbon there. Because again, carbon is going to help us to manage water. It's going to help us to manage nutrients. And that's what the plant needs to be able to grow. That and sunlight, and we're good. So here we go. Now we're going to be able to change this. So this paper came out in 2015. And not all of you necessarily want to go out there and read research papers, but I'm going to share a couple of different references here. And the reason that I do is that these references are also what are called open access. They're freely available. So you don't have to be a research scientist to be able to read these papers. It's also fairly readable. But the idea behind this paper is called The Contentious Nature of Soil Organic Matter. Johannes Lehmann is a research scientist at Cornell University. And Johannes is very well known for his work on humic substances, on that graph that I was showing you before. And he's been a part of this group in looking now, as we utilize technology to look at humic substances as the humus fraction, of changing the traditional viewpoint to the emergent viewpoint, to the fact that the microbes are really more about this transformation of organic matter into a stabilized fraction, and not about the microbes being involved in decomposition processes. And the great thing about looking at organic matter this way is if you look at organic matter from a decomposition point of view, highly decomposed organic matter is, yes, more stable. It's not going to go anywhere, but it's primarily carbon, double and triple bonded to other carbon atoms with a little bit of hydrogen on it. Decomposition removes oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and all of the other elements that are normally a part of organic matter. So if you're highly decomposed, you're highly condensed, a carbon atom, triple bonded or double bonded to another carbon atom, there's very little room there for you. It's very difficult to break double and triple bonds. It takes a lot of energy to do that. So that it would be difficult for you now to break one of those bonds to go out there and bind to nitrate or phosphate or sulfate. So it doesn't have the binding capacity that we're looking for carbon from. We don't put highly decomposed carbon in your stomach when you have absorbed a toxin to absorb that toxin. We put charcoal, which has a lot of binding capacity to it. It's not highly condensed charcoal. It's not highly burned off charcoal. You put charcoal because part of the reason that we have charcoal, it will burn. It will be able to give off energy because not all of its bonds are so tightly condensed. Now I need energy to break bonds as opposed to giving off energy when the bonds are broken. So it has that absorptive capacity. So this is what it is that we're looking for, is changing the way that we as scientists look at organic matter. But what that does is it allows us to be able to tell you what organic matter can do and what you can do and what your options are. Because now we're seeing that, again, the microbial community can impact how much organic matter we have. So what do I want you to do? How can you go about doing this? What is it that we can do to be able to change this? One of the things that is, again, I talked about the fact that it is a system that is incredibly complex yet elegantly simple. Repeated pattern design. Because biology follows many same rules, whether you're microscopic or macroscopic. Biochemistry, those biochemical reactions follow many of the same patterns. We are all designed to be able to follow many of the biochemical reactions. So the soil itself, when we are trying to regenerate the soil, we are trying to regenerate the biological community. Because again, soil, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen bound to a mineral matrix. To get the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, we need to have photosynthesis. To have photosynthesis, we need to have a matrix, a media, to grow those plants in that are going to do the photosynthesis that's going to be able to efficiently provide fertility and water. Because that's what the plant needs to do photosynthesis. The biological communities will help to improve these efficiencies, will help to generate this. So what we want to do, we can't necessarily directly impact sunlight, but what we can do is we can impact how much of that sunlight is absorbed by maximizing the amount of solar energy collectors we have, of solar cells. And our solar cells happen to be plants that we're growing. So if we want to impact our solar cells, those are photosynthetic cells inside the plant, we want to be able to have more of those for a longer period of time, because that's the plant now helping us to maximize how much sunlight we're going to absorb. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to kind of follow some very simple rules in treating the soil like we want to treat ourselves. You want to have a highly performing, profitable production system. To have a high-performing system that is relying on soil as its foundation, we need that soil to be as high-performing as possible. If you are going to train to be a high-performing athlete, these are the rules that you're going to be looking at. We want to eat small meals throughout the day, be a grazer. Constantly, not overloading all the time. Now granted, you can carb load as a high-performing athlete. You can overload at certain times to get peak performance at a particular time in response to an event, but then you want to keep going back to the fact that you're going to consistently providing food to the system. We're supposed to be grazers. In the soil, the food primarily directly or indirectly comes from the plant, from the growing plant. If you do not have a growing plant, you do not have this type of a performance that's going to happen. So what we've got going on now is we want to have plants present as much as possible. Now, I'm an American and you're Canadian, and you're going to tell me that I'm an idiot because I'm going to tell you that you need to have plants in Canada growing for a minimum of 260 days. Minimum. 260 days. Minimum. It's a 105-day vacation. Honestly, you should be ashamed of yourselves if you take a 105-day vacation. You may like it for a little while, but you should be ashamed of yourselves, and you're not going to be profitable if you take a 105-day vacation every year. So think about what it would take to have a plant growing for 260 days. This is not a plant, every plant that you're growing to grain. It's not every plant that you're growing to maximum capacity, to maximum Y-word, yield. It is a plant that is doing photosynthesis. Because the sun shines in most of Canada 365 days a year. Now, the further we get closer to the Arctic Circle, I'm going to give those guys a break. Guys close to the Arctic Circle, we're maybe looking at about 230. 260. That is your goal. That's what you need to set for yourself. And the reason is because we know there are organisms in the soil that are going to be eating 365. Not all of them, not to the highest capacity. 365, but there will be organisms that need to get fed 365. If you take 105 days off in feeding them, they're not going to be very happy. And when they're not very happy, their food source is going to be the organic matter that is stored as part of the soil matrix. So we're losing soil because the eaters are starving. You need to be feeding them. That's what it is that you're looking at. So we want to maximize how much food we can have going into the system. Now, the great thing about this is naturally, if we do this, we are going to increase diversity. Because, yes, as much as you're going to say, I'm an American and an idiot, and we're not going to listen to this person. She came up here, and I can't believe they've invited her here. She came up here, and she told us this stupid stuff, and she'll go back to America, and we can forget about it. But here's the deal. I recognize that, yes, if you grow wheat, canola, corn, or soybeans, flax, whatever plant it is that you're deciding to grow, alfalfa, whatever it is, there are times of the year that it will not be growing. So we need to be looking at adding diversity, having different plants growing at the same time, intercropping, cover cropping, relay cropping, polycropping. I don't care what you want to call it. Just get a green plant growing, because that is what we're trying to do in being able to build soil. So again, by looking at increasing the amount of time we're having carbon going below ground, it's automatically going to address us having a more diverse diet. Now, this one is a tough one. Exercise. It's tough for all of us. Exercise. None of us are very good exercisers. I represent that very well. Exercise means that we need to be looking at frequency, intensity, scale, and timing. As a high-performing athlete, as a high-performing soil, exercise doesn't mean that we stress to injury. We stress to loss. It means, though, that we do stress the system. And this is a really big key that we miss. Because what we're looking at with exercising and stressing the system is we are looking at allowing pressures to occur. Some of the largest organic soil resources that we've had on this planet were created in prairie ecosystems. They don't exist in the same way anymore because we've lost a lot of the carbon, we've lost a lot of the soil that's part of that. But the prairie ecosystems evolved over tens of thousands of years in response to stress events, in response to fire and grazing and insect pests. And we're going to try and regenerate and build those high organic matter systems where they had organic matter in the teens. We need to be able to do that, and we're going to be doing that based on utilizing stress events. Because again, biology follows a lot of the very same rules. In biological systems, one of the things that we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at essentially creating stress events so that the biology responds more efficiently. It picks up activity. Most times, every organism, me, you, plants, your cows, your sheep, birds, bats, bees, every organism is pre-programmed to be lazy. Yes. In your genetic brain is a programming to be lazy. What it is technically called is conservation of resources. We do the least amount of work for the greatest amount of reward. That's what it is that we're looking for. So, when I'm not under stress, I'm going to kick back. I don't have to perform at high efficiency. I don't have to do these things. I shouldn't have to eat a whole lot if I'm going to kick back, because I'm not asking for that high level of performance. So our prairie ecosystems, these high organic matter systems, evolved over tens of thousands of years in response to stress events that happen periodically, but in between time, the system just kicked back and waited. What we want to do is we want to energize these systems so that we're constantly having them to perform. We're going to put them under stress. Stress, again, comes from stressors that are going to impact our access to food. For the plant, it is its ability to do photosynthesis and its ability for that photosynthate to be utilized. So what we're going to do is we're going to allow for a little bit of pest impact, because impact is a stressor that is going to get me to perform at a higher level of efficiency. We're going to allow for a little bit of fertility impact, because that's going to make me perform at a higher level. And part of this performance at a higher level is us, plants, putting carbon resources below ground, giving them off as exudates to get those things from the soil, to get the fertility from the soil, to utilize that fertility that comes from the soil to make phytochemicals, including antioxidants, from that food, from those microorganisms, to be able to put that into. So they're going to trade carbon for these resources, so those resources can then allow for the plant to be able to flourish and become more resilient. So we want to have a little bit of stress. Again, not stress to injury, not stress to loss, but have a little bit of stress. I know I'm keeping you from lunch, so I want to do two things very quickly. We're going to skip over some of this. One of the other ways that I want you to be able to look at this is doing what I refer to as eco-functional intensification. Intensify your system. Have it performing at a higher level all the time. Look at every square meter on your landscape and determine what may be the best use of that. Do I really want to be growing a crop here because I know that when I grow a crop here, it doesn't perform quite as well? So I can use technological tools to maybe not plant seeds in this part of my field that are going to be from my cash crop, but it could be something that I put in a perennial spot, a pollinator strip, something to be able to help us to utilize water better, more efficiently, either too much or too little, and to attract various types of predators that are going to be able to help to manage pest and disease issues that I see. Why don't I do that instead of it having to be the poorest spot on my farm? Looking at how we can maximize efficiencies by maximizing their eco-function. If their eco-function is to produce me the highest producing crop, I want to maximize what they can do there. But if this eco-function over here doesn't produce that much, what could I use it for instead? How could I be able to look at this? And so what we want to do, these are some of the soil health principles that have been talked about. Now, mostly there are 4, sometimes 5 soil health principles that are talked about, 4, sometimes 5. Looking at maximizing photosynthetic activity, keeping it green and growing, 260 days. Carbon is our problem. The only way we're going to get carbon into it is photosynthesis. So we need to solve that. Looking at diversity. Solving this, addressing this, will automatically address this. reducing synthetic inputs, managing livestock, and reducing tillage are all going to be about those stressors. The exercise. The organisms in the soil, either directly or indirectly, many of them will utilize carbon coming from the plant, and they'll utilize that carbon coming from the plant to either directly or indirectly address fertility or water. Now, they've got a lot of mechanisms on how they do that, but those are the two things they're trying to do. Because again, if you're dependent upon getting carbon from a plant, addressing fertility and water is what the plant needs to be able to do photosynthesis from you. So, if we put inputs into the system, especially fertilizers into the system, that outsource the jobs of the microbial community, if for the plant you wrote a check to your bank account to add that fertility, so your banker's getting stressed, and you're getting stressed, but now you've given it to the plant, and to the plant it's free. Why would the plant pay carbon exudates to the microbial community to get something that you gave to it for free? It's not going to do that. So we outsource the jobs of the microbial community, and then we run crying and saying, why aren't the microbes there? If you don't have a job, you don't get paid. If you don't get paid, you don't eat. All biology follows some of the same basic rules. So we need to look at how it is that we can be addressing those. Some of those organisms will help either directly or indirectly in helping to manage pest and disease relationships, predator and prey relationships. If you add a lot of pesticides to the system and outsource their job, guess what? They don't eat. If they don't eat, they don't reproduce. If they don't reproduce, their function declines. We're not building soil. So we want to address reducing inputs. If we address reducing tillage in the system so that we don't destroy the bodies or the habitats of the microbial communities. If you get your arm ripped off and you're homeless, you might survive, but it's going to be tough, especially to survive a Canadian winter. Homeless without arms. So, what can we do to help the microbial community not be homeless and without limbs? We can reduce the amount of disturbance that we have. Managing livestock. Managing livestock is about looking at how we can have more carbon flowing below ground in response to stress events that are creating wounds on the plant tissue. Creating wounds on the plant tissue means that you now, if you are wounded, my analogy for this is I got lost in the woods, and when I was lost in the woods, I got attacked by a bear. My instinct is to put my arms up to protect my head and my face. Put my arms up to protect my head and my face. My arms get ripped to shreds. I survived the attack. The bear thought I was dead or something and left me alone. But now I need to get myself out of the woods. And I'm bleeding. I am better off putting a tourniquet on my arm, on my upper arm, and potentially losing my arms than I would be putting bandages all over my arm. Because I don't have enough resources to be able to withstand that stress of putting all of the clotting factors and the antibodies that are needed to protect those wounds. Grazing events, that animal impact, grazing, animals walking through, trampling, anything that is wounding a plant leaf is doing the same thing. And for the plant to produce the plant clotting factors and antibodies requires micronutrients from the soil, and so they will give off exudates into the soil to be able to get that material. Now we also want to protect the soil from the impact of radiation and wind and water, from energy, disrupting the soil, protection, soil armor, crop residue, living plants, anything that we possibly can have to be able to do that. One more last thing before we go to lunch, because this is an appropriate thing before you go feed your gut microbiome. So that's what you're going to be doing, is feeding your gut microbiome. When we look at this and we look at trying to address this, we are going to be able to look at redistributing risk. So again, I said that David Brandt has billions of employees that paint the soil black. They're called microorganisms. There are billions of them in a handful of healthy soil, and they will paint the soil black with carbon that they are stabilizing through their biological processes. So we're going to redistribute risk, but we're also going to improve nutrient density. And this is what I want to leave you with. We have options and opportunities to work together to be able to address the needs that our citizens currently have, not just in the United States, but also in Canada. I am a citizen of a first world country that has $1 trillion budget deficit. So economically we're stressed, but we're also stressed because as a citizen of a first world country, I am an obese, malnourished human being. I do not get any more the food, the quality of the food, the micronutrients, the antioxidants, and the phytochemicals from what it is that I'm consuming. I am an obese, malnourished human being that lives in a country that does not have universal health care, and therefore means that 67% of my population is one minor health care crisis. Minor, not major. This doesn't mean cancer or heart attack or anything like that. That means somebody breaking their arm away from bankruptcy. This is not sustainable. I'm a citizen of a first world country that for the first time in our history has our life expectancy going down rather than up. I have a grandniece and a grandnephew that are about a year apart. My grandnephew is the youngest, and not just because he is male. He is not expected to outlive his sister. For 4 consecutive years, our life expectancy is going down. I live in a first world country whose infant mortality rate ranks below Cuba. A country that has been dependent primarily on creating its own cycling of fertility to feed its own people because it has been under embargo. These things provide us, I'm telling you this, not to make you sad, but to make you, one, angry, but more importantly, to recognize your opportunities. You do the most important job, providing food. None of us, every biological organism, if nothing else that you heard today, understanding that everybody needs carbon. Everybody needs food. You do the most important job, and you have the opportunity, the option to leverage that, to be able to get paid for that. We do not pay for the true cost of food production. Not directly at the grocery store, not directly at the elevator. We pay for the true cost of food production in our taxes because of what the food production system has costed us and how it's impacting ecosystem services, air and water quality and availability. So again, I hope that you will use the opportunity of this type of a meeting to try and create networks and consortia and a number of you who can work together to be able to, not just as Lana was talking about, share information on how to go about doing this and the tools and how to put that into place, but also how to sell it and market it. Large food companies are looking to find a way to address these issues. And they have no idea how to talk to you. I've been in many meetings with them where they're like, it's a completely different language. And it is. And you don't necessarily know how to talk to them as individuals. But as a group, you guys can get together, guys and gals can get together and figure out a way to be able to address this. So you leverage the power of who you are if you want to be profitable. And I think that you all do. So with that, I'm going to let you go feed your gut microbiome. I will be around for most of the day. Unfortunately, I have a shuttle I have to catch at 3 o'clock. But if you have any questions, because I'm sure everybody wants to feed their gut microbiome before the next session. If you have any questions, please feel free to come down and ask me or to reach out to me throughout the day. I'm going to just go back quick so that you can. Actually, I'm going to go forward very quickly. See, I have lots of things to say, but I basically say those things. I swear, if I put one slide in, I could talk for 3 hours. So I tried, like, minimizing the number of slides, maximizing, it doesn't matter. That is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. And also, again, take this quote to heart.
Thank you so much.
Everything's interrelated.
Small good.
Thank you. Thank you all.